In this video, we're going to take a look at the last two objectives here, multiplying real numbers and dividing real numbers. Let's start with a few examples of multiplying real numbers. Let's take the number 3 times 3. What does that mean? Well, multiplying is essentially adding in groups. See, we are going to add 3 groups of units. And what are the size of those units? 3 units. So we're going to add 3 groups of, and of is a fancy way of saying times, 3 units. So starting at 0, we're going to jump by 3 at a time. So we'll jump to 3. That's one group of 3. And then we're going to jump by 3 again. And that's 2 groups of 3. And then finally we're going to jump a third time by 3 all the way to the number 9. And that's our third group of 3. So 3 times 3 equals 9. When I multiply 3 times 3, I get 9. Another way of looking at that is if I have a group that has 3 objects in it, if I have 3 of those groups, if I have 3 groups of 3 objects, then essentially I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 objects. So that's multiplying. That's multiplying. Both of these numbers are positive, and notice that our product, when I multiply two positive numbers, is also a positive number. So one good thing to note is that a positive number times a positive number equals a positive number. What if I now had 2 times a negative 4? What that means is we're going to jump by 2 in a negative 4 direction. Okay. Or I'm going to do that in the negative directions 4 times. Or I'm going to jump 2 times in the negative 4 direction. Either way, it's the same thing. By starting at 0, I'm going to go, let's do it the first way. Jump by 2 in the negative direction 4 times. So I go 1 time there. That's 2 times 1. Then I go another time from negative 2 to negative 4. That's 2 times 2 negative. Then I go from negative 4 again. I jump again to negative 6. That's 3. And then I have one more jump to do. And I end up on negative 8. And that's 4 times. So 2 times a negative 4 is a negative 8. And so that's consistent with what we've seen before. Here we have, well, we're jumping in groups of a number of times. This we're going to jump in groups of positive 2, and we're going to jump in a negative direction 4 times. So when I have here, I have a positive number, that positive 2, and when I multiply it by a negative number, my product is negative. Now what were to happen if instead of having a positive 2, I had a negative 2? And I multiplied negative 2 by negative 4. Well, what that would do is that would change my answer dramatically. Because now, instead of jumping by 2 in whatever direction this says, see, this says jump by 2 in whatever direction that says. This now says jump by 2 in the opposite. This says opposite. That says, let's use a color that actually has ink on it. Let's do the opposite. Jump the opposite way of whatever that tells you to jump. Well, this tells me to jump in a negative 4 direction. But the opposite of negative is positive. So when I have a negative 2 times a negative 4, I am going to go 2 times that way, That's once. 2 times that way. It's twice. 2 times that way. It's 3 times. And 2 more again, and end up here at a positive 8. So a negative times a negative, stay consistent with our colors, a negative number times a negative number is a positive number. So those are rules for multiplying. Let's take a look at what division means. Division is exactly the opposite of that. If I have 3 and I'm multiplying it by some number I don't know, and my answer is 9, then basically, how do I get to 9 in going by 3's? In going by 3's, how do I get to 9? So, well, if I start at 9 and I go backwards by 3 that way, and then by 3 again that way, oops, all the way to there. That didn't come out all that great. Let's try that again. I start at 9, I go by 3 that way, and then I go again by 3 that way, and then I go by 3 that way. I can say, oh, I went a total of 1, 2, 3 times. So it's 3 times 3. 3 times 3 is 9. That's what division is, and we can write it a couple of different ways. We can write it as what number times 3 is 9. This is the long division way of writing it. And you'd have to know that 3 times 3 is 9. And we subtract those and give. Or I could write it as 9 divided by 3. And we know that 9 divided by 3 is 3, as we've seen already. This is a ratio. This is a fraction. Now, when we're dividing and when we're multiplying, there's a very special relationship we need to pay attention to. And that relationship is called our multiplicative identity. Now, if you recall from a previous video, the additive identity was 0. Here, in multiplying, the identity is 1. And what that means is, here, let's write the fancy European one. And what that means is if I take any number in the world and I multiply it by 1, then I get that number. And that's important to realize because every time you see a number, this 3 here is essentially saying 3 times 1. Now, we don't have to write the times 1, but we have to understand it's the times 1. So if the multiplicative identity is 1, this is the multiplicative identity here, the number 1, then we can also understand the concept of a multiplicative inverse. And remember, doing any inverse of an identity will yield the identity. So what this implies is if I take the number a and I divide it by a, I will get 1. And essentially any number over itself is 1. 3 over 3 is 1. 9 over 9 is 1. Alright, a smiley face over a smiley face is 1. So that's multiplying. If you would like some more practice on multiplying and dividing bigger numbers, longer numbers, we can certainly take care of that in class. What I wanted to make sure we understood was our rules about multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. That if I have a positive number times a positive number, that will be a positive number. And as we saw here, if I have a negative number times a negative number, that will also be a positive number. Whereas in the previous example here, when I have a positive times a negative number times a negative number is a negative number. And by the laws of commutation, or the commutative law of multiplying, a negative times a positive is always also a negative. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that the real difference between these two here and these two here is that up here I'm multiplying an even number of negatives, especially this one right here. An even number. A negative times a negative is a positive. Here I have an odd number of negatives. So if I'm multiplying a negative times a negative times a negative, well, that's an odd number of negatives. My answer will be negative. And here, if I'm multiplying a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative, well, that's an even number of negatives. And that kind of follows these rules up here. So that answer will be a positive. That's all for multiplying and dividing real numbers. We will see you in the next video.